In history this week, you are going to be reading chapter 5 and chapter 6 from the book. I'm just going to take a few minutes and I'm going to read these out loud to you, okay? Chapter 5, Enslaved People in the Colonies, okay? It says, as the settlers got to know the Powhatan, they saw that they grew tobacco plants and smoked tobacco in pipes. The English settlers had not found gold, but they had found a plant that could make England rich. They realized that if they grew their own tobacco, they could ship it back to England and sell it. So they didn't find gold, but they did find a crop that the Indians were planting that they seen could make them a lot of money if they sold it back to England, and that crop was tobacco. In the picture down here, it says many different Native American groups smoked tobacco. They made beautifully carved tobacco pipes. And if you look in your book in the colored ones, or in the colored books on your computer, you can see some pictures of the different pipes the Indians had made. Before long, people in England were smoking lots of tobacco from Virginia. In fact, Jamestown was making so much money that the colony's farmers wanted to grow even more tobacco. To grow more tobacco, they needed more people. Some people came from England to do this hard work, but before long, there was a need for many more workers. So the colonists in Jamestown were making lots of money by growing the tobacco plants and selling them back to England. And they knew the more they grew, the more they could sell, the more money they could make. So they needed more workers, and they didn't have enough people to do the job. It says over a period of time, the people were enslaved. It says people were enslaved and brought from Africa to work on large farms called plantations. So a large farm is called a plantation, and they got people from Africa to do this. These plantations were mostly in English colonies in the South. Enslaved Africans were not free. They did not choose to plant tobacco. These enslaved people were bought and sold like the tobacco they were growing. This is a sad part of our history. Now, you remember back when we were in the school, we learned about Black History Month and we learned about Harriet Tubman. This is kind of where the slavery in the United States started. Even before we were the United States, it started when the English had their colonies over here with the growing of tobacco and the need for workers. All right, chapter 6. The Pilgrims arrive in Plymouth. Now, this makes me think of Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and stuff. So we know a lot about this because we did this kind of stuff back in November. So this will be more of a review and helping us to see how Thanksgiving fell in line with the founding of the United States. One group of people called the Pilgrims set off for Virginia for different reasons. They did not want to grow tobacco or find gold. Instead, they wanted to pray to God in their own way. Remember, we learned about the Pilgrims coming to the New World for religious freedoms. This was not possible in England, so the Pilgrims set sail on a ship called the Mayflower. The Mayflower was a small ship, and there was not much room for its 102 passengers and 30 sailors. The passengers slept mostly on the floor and in hammocks below the main deck. For the first month, the voyage went well. Then stormy weather arrived, and some passengers became very ill. Remember, we talked about how horrible that trip would have been. They couldn't go above onto the top deck. They had to stay in that one part of the ship. Remember, we talked about how little it was and how they had to do everything in that one area. So it was pretty crammed, lots of sick people. It was a miserable time. The storms at sea were so bad that the Mayflower was blown off course. So that means that they lost their way. They got lost just a little bit. The Pilgrims never arrived in Virginia. Instead, they arrived in what is today Massachusetts in New England. The place they chose to settle had once been a Wampanoag village. The Pilgrims named their new home Plymouth. The Pilgrims had also arrived as the weather was turning cold. It was too late to plant crops, and somehow the settlers needed to get through the cold winter months. The Pilgrims set about building homes. Because it was so cold, the women and children slept on the Mayflower. Many people died due to the cold, sickness, and the lack of food. People began to lose hope, but then spring came and help arrived too. A Native American by the name of Squanto, remember we learned about Squanto and how he helped the Pilgrims learn how to plant crops using fish? Squanto, who spoke English, showed the Pilgrims how to plant crops on land that was new to them. Squanto also helped the Pilgrims or showed the Pilgrims how to hunt and fish. With more food to eat, the Pilgrims grew strong again. To celebrate, Squanto and the members of the Wampanoag joined the Pilgrims for a feast of Thanksgiving. They ate roasted deer and turkey. They ate the fish they had caught and the vegetables they had grown. Once again, Native Americans had helped people from another land survive.